Hey there, I'm Bailey and welcome to my channel where we discuss all the tips and tricks necessary for you to live a life of adventure. Have you ever wanted to visit someplace like Colorado or the high Sierras, but you're not really sure about the high altitude? You've heard that there's lots of really tall peaks and that some people get sick when they go there from the first time, especially if they're coming from sea level. Now, luckily for you, I'm actually born and raised from Colorado, lived there most of my life, and have quite a bit of experience with high altitude hiking. So I kind of want to share some of my knowledge about dealing with altitude as far as altitude sickness. Now I do want to say before we dive super far into this video that of course I am not a doctor or a nurse, so if you are experiencing symptoms related to altitude sickness or you have further and deeper questions, that you might want to consider talking to them first. And also, if you are looking for more tips and tricks related to hiking and backpacking, especially if you're a thru hiker, then you might want to consider subscribing to my channel. Okay, so first things first, what is altitude sickness? So if you are not familiar with the altitude, you've lived at sea level your whole life or like 3,000, 4,000 feet, then altitude sickness is basically what happens when your body is trying to adjust to lack of oxygen related to being at a higher altitude in comparison to our planet's atmosphere. So essentially, the higher up you get in the atmosphere, the less oxygen there is, just because there's less pressure to hold that oxygen down. And that means that there's less oxygen for your body to use to perform your normal bodily functions like creating energy, heat, breaking down things, whatever. This is a problem because with less oxygen, things kind of start to go wonky in your body. You might start to feel lightheaded, get a headache, become dizzy. You might start to feel sick, like you're going to vomit. Some people have difficulty sleeping at high altitude. That's pretty common. You can even get things like confusion. Worst case scenario, if this continues to go on and becomes very severe, some people develop what's called high altitude pulmonary edema, which is basically where fluid leaks out of your heart and into your lungs and just kind of like suffocates you from the inside. So really not a good thing at all. Now, if this happens, then you definitely should consider seeing a doctor, and it is a pretty serious thing. So that's why it's very important to be aware of high altitude symptoms and what you should do and can do to prevent it and to be able to enjoy your trip better going forward in the future. Now, fortunately, people are adaptable. You know, the planet is a pretty diverse place. So there's some people that just, their families have lived at high altitude for generations and generations and generations. Like people that are from the Andes as well as from the Himalayas where, they live above 14,000 feet and their bodies are just well adjusted. Luckily for the rest of us, we can actually adapt too. So this process is called acclimatization. And that's basically where your body is able to hold more oxygen inside to be able to combat, dealing with less oxygen in the air. Now, this does take time, but less than you would think, and there's a lot of things you can do to help the process go much smoother and better for you. So we're going to get into what those kinds of things are in a minute, but I do want to point out and say that if you are wondering, high altitude is considered to be above 5,000 feet. So if you're coming from a place that's lower than about eastern Colorado, so a lot of places on the East Coast, a lot of places kind of in the west and the middle in the Great Basin kind of area, you might just be more susceptible. Like for me, because I've been living basically at sea level, this is probably something I'm going to have to deal with next time I go back to Colorado. So, keep that in mind. The other thing is that everyone is susceptible to altitude sickness. It doesn't really matter if you're from Colorado or not. Some people that have lived in Denver their whole lives get altitude sickness when doing 14ers. Some people from the East Coast that come from sea level are able to bag tall peaks in the Sierras and stuff without showing any sort of symptoms whatsoever. Some people get altitude sickness the first time, but not later. Some people that have never had altitude sickness might get altitude sickness randomly one time. You just never know. So, it really doesn't discriminate at all, and it's just good to be aware of the symptoms and things you can do to prevent it going forward in the future. So what are those things that you can do to minimize your likelihood of developing altitude sickness? So let's say that you are going to be hiking the Colorado Trail and you're flying in from someplace that's pretty close to sea level. The first thing I would suggest would be to drive to the trail. So rather than flying, which of course is much faster, by driving, it takes a little bit more time and it also allows you to slowly build up to that base elevation of 5,000 feet in Denver. This is why sometimes it's good. A lot of people suggest hiking the Colorado Trail SOBO instead of northbound, just because you're starting at a lower elevation and you have more time to build up. Now that's very important too. So if you are just getting used to it, it's good to take, a couple days, maybe just take it slow, relax around someplace like Denver or even a little higher. like Durango, Dillon, those kinds of places, Estes Park. You know, do some walking, that kind of thing, but kind of take it easy so your body has time to build up more of those red blood cells, hold on to more oxygen, and adjust. Then, when you do start hiking, you know, take it slow the first day. Don't try to run right out of the gate. You know, go slow, listen to your body. That's one of the most important things you can do, and just kind of see what happens over time. Some other things you can think about doing would include drinking a lot of water just to make sure you stay hydrated, and stay away from alcohol, as that can, you know, is like the opposite of hydration. And also, if you're not used to altitude, you will notice the effects of alcohol a lot more severely at high elevations, just FYI. So let's say that you've done all of these things I just talked about, but you are still feeling some different signs of altitude sickness. Well, what do you do now? Unfortunately, there really are not a lot of options. You really just need to get back down to a lower elevation, whether that means hiking back out, driving to someplace that's lower, whatever. The reason is because, you know, even if your symptoms are somewhat mild, you really don't want them to develop into something more severe, like high altitude pulmonary edema. And so the best thing is just to get back lower so your body has time to adjust. Really, if you're experiencing pretty severe symptoms, then it would be a good idea to go see a doctor and just make sure that everything is okay. Then maybe you could take a few days off and then try to build back up again, or go from there and work with your doctor from there. I will say I have known some people with altitude related symptoms that have just drank more water and pushed through, especially on 14ers, and they've gotten over it, or were just fine. But you know, it's always going to be better safe than sorry. So do keep that in mind. You know, you want to take care of your body. So I do have a couple other tips I want to mention real quick. So the first one along with that is if you have experienced some symptoms related to altitude and you are not sure what's going to happen the next time you visit altitude, then you might want to consider talking to your doctor and see if they will prescribe you a medication that can help your body acclimatize faster. So some examples are like Diamox is one that we talked about. And like I said, that doesn't like mask your symptoms. It's supposed to help your body be able to build more of those blood cells and hold on to oxygen much faster. Because of that, you do want to start it before you get to altitude. So that's why it's a good thing that if you know that you've experienced symptoms in the past, you might want to talk to a doctor before you leave for your trip. And as I've already mentioned, just having that extra cushion time on your trip can be helpful. You don't want to feel in a rush like you have to start hiking right away when you go on your trip. So if you can plan a couple extra days at the beginning, just so you can acclimatize, that will make things much less stressful and much less likely to develop those symptoms. And then finally, I do want to say that, you know, I hike a lot with my dogs and I hear this question asked a lot, and dogs technically can get altitude sickness. Actually, there's plenty of animals can. You know, if you have cattle, then you might have heard of Brisket's disease before. It's the same thing. So fortunately, even though they can get it, it is much less common than it is in people. And so as long as you are taking precautions for yourself, like by hiking slowly, starting slowly, drinking water, those kinds of things, and do the same for your dog when they're with you, then your dog most likely won't show any symptoms. Now, I do want to say if you're watching this video because you've never hiked, you know, in Colorado or the Sierras before, then you might also want to consider watching this video all about how to read thunderstorms. Because the other thing we have to deal in Colorado are monsoon thunderstorms. So this can be a huge problem if you're above tree line, and you just might want to consider taking a look at that video if you have never hiked in monsoon season before in Colorado. Other than that, we'll see you over at that video and have happy trails.